did cloaks actually exist as a functioning piece of garment? Because especially if you're travelling, where do you put your bag? If you're walking and you're not on horseback and you've got a cloak on, your bag, does it go over your cloak? Does your bag go under your cloak? How do they waterproof cloaks? What's the point of a cloak if it's not waterproof? It's just material. It'll soak up all the water. So therefore, did they used to put beeswax on it?
Cloaks. So cloaks were a really kind of popular and staple item of medieval outerwear. We see them depicted up and down the social ladder. So we see kind of more utilitarian designs. We see fancier designs. One of the things that fantasy movies always get wrong is with fur. They always put fur on the outside so that the fur is the outermost layer. And when we look at the historical record, it was switched. Fur was usually the lining of a cloak or the lining of a hood, and that's what kept you warm. The outer layer is what's really important for use in inclement weather that prevents it from soaking up water, and that's the wool. Wool is a naturally water-resistant material. Even modern wools, which are heavily processed, if you wear a nice dense weave of wool outside, it doesn't soak up water nearly as fast as, say, something like a cotton. If you've ever gotten cotton socks wet, they take forever to dry out. Wool socks wick away moisture. They dry very quickly when they do get wet. And the other part of this is lanolin. Wool-bearing animals naturally excrete a wax called lanolin. And modernly, it's typically removed in the processing of wool fibers. But in historical times, the lanolin would have been mostly retained in the wool fibers, and when that wax is distributed over the wool, it will literally make the water bead off the wool to a certain extent, offering very effective waterproofing.
Jesus, not everything in medieval times was about function. They're allowed fashion too.
Now I know they've both got magical weapons there, Excalibur and, the spell-enchanted armour and blade. But what's the reality of anything piercing through armour? I know you used to use like war hammers and, spiked, basically maces, if you will. But is there any way swords are used to penetrate, or is it pure never and it's only at the weak spots that are done? Or when, like you get samurai test cuts on helmets, and I know it's a debated subject, but apart from half swording, is there any point in using the tip of the weapon, or even the blade itself against armour? Is there any use in using the blade against armour at that point?
Using the blade against plate armour? No, there's not much point to it. If you're wearing, proper armour, I mean, if the armour's made out of tin-plated dirt, well then, yeah, you might be able to get through it. But no, proper armour, the blade of a sword doesn't have much mass, okay? So they're not going to transfer too much blunt force. In some cases they might. If it's a really big sword and you do this huge hit to the head, well, you might be able to hurt someone with the blade. But that's more the exception than the rule. In most circumstances, the blade will be absolutely useless against someone wearing plate armor. The point, that's a bit different. The point will never go through if it's a proper steel plate made to even a moderate level of quality. The point of a sword will never get through that thing. And even those weapons that do have big spikes, like the spike on the back of a warhammer, or indeed just a war pick, these spiky kind of points are generally better employed in trying to attack the gaps in armor, and also to hook and pull people down. Because when it comes to mail, well, these tips, and even, in certain circumstances, depending on how acute the tip is on a sword, well, they can get through mail. What we really need to understand, though, is that getting through armor was generally far more difficult than most people perceive or is represented in movies.
Now, I reckon that my YouTube colleagues here have beautifully and thoroughly explained why it would not make sense or would be nonsensical to try and hit an opponent in full plate armor with a bladed weapon, using it with chopping and cutting motions, as opposed to half-swording or using more appropriate implements of combat. In defense of the film, however, I would like to point out that perhaps there might be a different interpretation to the duel scene, for example, between Arthur and Lancelot. Now, in that scene, what we see is at first that they start with this sort of jousting, which is actually not bad in its execution. The only problem I see there is the way, during the second time that they come at each other, how Arthur points the lance on the wrong side of the horse rather than on the opposite side, and as a matter of fact, he falls down. It's interesting how Lancelot, however, decides to dismount, so renouncing his newly gained advantage because of honor. And as a matter of fact, I think the fact that Arthur removes his helmet and then Lancelot does the same should also be interpreted as a very honorable way of dueling that Lancelot considers to be very, very important and part of his chivalric code. Now, then what they start doing is they start bashing each other with the swords. Now, apart from that, the fact that I think that a couple of times they did try to use the point of the sword, so there is a little bit of unswording in that scene. But what's interesting about it is that I think there might be a reason. You see, King Arthur in that scene is using Excalibur, a magically infused weapon. Now, magically infused weapons or magical weapons don't behave, of course, the same way. We should not expect them to behave the same way as regular weapons. Excalibur is able, if you manage to get the proper hit, to go through plate armor. Clearly Arthur understands that, and so he doesn't care. But why does Lancelot then choose to cut? Well, I think that the reason is quite simple. I believe that Lancelot did not want to duel his king, and he doesn't want to hurt him. So I think that the reason why he is bashing the armor with his sword and with using the blade is because he actually doesn't want to hurt him, but he just wants to probably tire him down, hoping that he would desist. Now, this is just my personal opinion or interpretation, of course, but I think it just makes the scene less problematic if read through this perspective.
The question between shiny armour and blued blackened armour. What's the difference between the two? In many of the medieval depictions you see it in blued blacked armour. Did this ever exist, this idea of shiny armour?
Shiny armor, blued armor. So, shiny armor, did it exist in the Middle Ages? Absolutely it did. However, unlike today where a shiny piece of metal is kind of something we encounter all the time, the act of polishing the surfaces of armor was a very laborious and very expensive task in the Middle Ages. You needed equipment like water-powered polishing wheels. You didn't have a bench grinder with a buffing wheel that you could just plug it in and turn it on. So you paid to have a very shiny surface. It was an outward display of wealth. So while shiny armors definitely existed, they were associated with a person being able to afford a shiny armor. In fact, Dr. Toby Capwell mentions in one of his lectures an anecdote where in the 1930s a museum was doing work on an original 15th century helmet, I believe, and they drilled out the rivets to remove a reinforcement plate on the helmet, and when they took that reinforcement plate off, the original 15th century finish on the underlying armor was still present, and it was basically a mirror polished surface so they could see their reflection in it. And that would have been something that would have been very expensive in the Middle Ages.
Was there anyone still believing in the old gods, the old ways? I know witchcraft was still practiced quite late, but was there any struggle between the old religions and this at this point? I presume no, but is there any proof of this?
Ah, yes, the mixing of religions. You know what, this is a rather complex topic, but let's just leave it at this. Honestly, most of the intermixing of religions happened very slowly over time and without a lot of fanfare, especially post-Roman era. There was a lot of times where you had these Gaelic and Celtic religions that would kind of mix and blend and intermarry with Christian religions, and eventually Christianity just kind of won out. You actually see this very well documented with the Vikings because, well, they went and they raided and pillaged and they did all these things and even went and sacked monasteries, but over time they adopted Christianity and even made it more so their own than a lot of the Christians that had it for generations. So yeah, there was a lot of this back and forth that would happen and a lot of conversations and a lot of things like canonization of scripture. But honestly, this is all just over dramatized.
5 parts! We have just done 5 parts and Antony still cannot... Oh, he's actually starting to understand. Antony is starting to understand? Egads! In fact, there is only one more episode in this epic series, where Antony makes a fatal mistake. He asks Ninja Eugene a question. That is right, as painful as it is for me to say, Ninja Eugene will be appearing in a Medieval Mythbusters production. The Travesty! Follow the link to watch the horrible fallout of this terrible decision.